Welcome to the speaker's tent. My name's Susan Twining. I'm the Chief Land Use Policy Advisor at the Country Land and Business Association. We're a membership organisation for owners of rural land, business and property across England and Wales. We've been working with natural capital and nature markets for a number of years, helping our members to understand what the market's about and what the opportunities are, and also working with government on the policy aspects of it. Today, this session is titled as a teach-in, so we're going to go back to basics and cover some of the nuts and bolts of what we mean by nature markets and natural capital. I'm going to cover that in a moment, and then I'm going to introduce an amazing panel who are going to cover some other aspects. So firstly, we've got Helen Avery, who's the Nature Project Director at the Green Finance Institute, and she's going to do a step-by-step run through of how to get into nature markets and the things that you need to do. And then we're going to look at nature markets in practice with Glenn Anderson from the Wendling Beck and Swallowtail. And he's got real live experience of running projects like this, so he will be able to run through the detail. And then hopefully, if we don't talk too long, we'll have time for questions at the end. So please think of your questions as you go along. So let's make a start. So I've already covered that one. That's what we're going to talk about. First point, when we're thinking about natural capital, why is it important? What are we talking about, and why is it important? And I think we've talked about natural capital for many years in policy circles, but it's really becoming more embedded in the discussions in farming. And really, it is core to farming and land management. We're talking about all the natural capital assets, the land and the soil, the watercourses, the hedgerows, the trees, all the nature and natural features that you've got on your land holdings. What you get from those is ecosystem services. So that's the wildlife habitats, the carbon storage, the water regulation, recreation activities, and drinking water, clean drinking water. The next step, which is really what we're going to be talking a bit more about today, is how can you put a value in that or monetize it? Where can you get funding for your environmental goods that you're creating? So there's a number of ways from this. There's the value that it provides to society and for businesses. So with government, we talk about the rationale for the government funding environmental works is mainly around payments for public goods. It can be about market failure, but at the moment it's mainly about payment for public goods. It could be about compensation for damage, and we're seeing that through the carbon markets, creating carbon credits, or for biodiversity net gain, which is about compensating for damage from development. And then there's a big area around environmental responsibility. More and more businesses are looking at their environmental responsibility and looking at taking action to ensure that they are seen to do the right thing and address all the environmental issues that they cause. So if we look at the different types of environmental funding, I've put it into 4 buckets. Different people categorize it in different ways. Firstly, there's the government schemes. This is something that many of you will be familiar with, the long track record of agri-environment schemes going back over 20 years. So the idea that nature markets and environmental funding is new is wrong when you think about the length of the agri-environment schemes. But we've also got woodland creation funding, and quite often we're now seeing more targeted funding. The policies are different in England, Wales and Scotland, if anybody's here from Scotland. Part of the challenge with the government policy is that they are subject to change, as we are seeing at the moment. And most of the contracts, this is not necessarily a bad thing, they're relatively short term. So the Sustainable Farming Incentive in England is a 3-year contract, which can be a good thing because it allows you to go get funding for relatively short times. You get lots of flexibility. Another good point is that it's relatively secure funding. The second group is offset markets. This is really what we're thinking about when we talk about nature markets. You've got the compliance markets, which is really driving the discussion at the moment. There are things where the government have mandated that they must be done. So we're talking about biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality in the compliance markets. And then you've got the voluntary markets where businesses are being driven to are being encouraged or driven sometimes by legislation now to reduce their carbon and offset their carbon emissions. But that could also be coming through for nature as well in the future. I think the challenge with the nature markets, these offset markets, is that they are long-term. They're looking at minimum 30 years, up to 120 for nutrient neutrality. So it's a very different way of thinking about environmental delivery. So they're long-term, quite often high entry costs of getting into those markets as well. So you need to have a different way of thinking about it. It's more about thinking about it in terms of diversification. You often have to invest quite a bit in order to get into those markets and creating the credits. The third group is business funding, corporate funding. So many large corporate businesses and quite often smaller local businesses may be interested in investing and funding environmental projects because it's good for their business. It's good for marketing. It's part of their CSR, their corporate social responsibility, or their environment, social and governance policies. And that's a real driver that is starting to come through into marketplaces now, where you're not necessarily creating credits. It's not an offset market. It's people who just want to fund a project and be seen to be doing good things for the environment. And then finally, we've got charities. These are long-standing opportunities for funding for landowners through the charity route. And often business funding or corporate funding goes through those charity routes as well. So they're a great way of accessing some of that business funding alongside advice. So they're well established. I've only put a few charities on there, but there's lots of other charities as well. I think what's interesting about the charities is they often come with advice and quite often voluntary labour and other things, depending on what the barriers are to progressing. So that's the four main types of environmental funding for landowners. I'm just going to say a little bit more about each of those. Firstly, the government funding. I expect most of you in the room are aware of, in England, the environmental land management schemes. And just trying to put a bit of perspective on this, this could be potentially about £2 billion per year that will come into these schemes. So it's a significant amount of money and a significant pot of environmental funding. There are three different schemes within environmental land management. There's the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which was initially launched last year. There's a new SFI 2024 that is going to be available this year with an expanded offer, and uptake of that has been excellent so far, and we're expecting that to increase when the 2024 offer is fully available. There's higher tier countryside stewardship, which is a scheme that's quite well established and around for now, but even that is evolving with more opportunities, different options available. And then there's the landscape recovery projects, which are large-scale, landscape-scale, long-term land use change projects. And they're really testing out how you can do collaborative landscape-scale projects. We've also got legacy schemes that are still running, so things like the higher level stewardship scheme are still running, but will gradually phase out. And we mustn't forget the England Woodland Creation Offer, which is one of the best grant offers for woodland creation that we've seen for some time. There's quite a lot of other government funding as well. We focus a lot on environmental land management schemes, but there are many other schemes within the government programme that come out in calls every now and again that may be right for different businesses. Things like the Species Recovery Programme that's been running for a number of years. That's Natural England that lead on that. Species Survival Fund is a targeted fund for species that are under threat. There's the Natural Flood Management Programme as well, which is funding natural flood management schemes. The clue is in the name. But there's been, the recent round had 25 million put into that, and there's now something like 60 odd schemes being funded over the last 3 years, and they're planning to do more. The Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund is slightly different. That's really more about helping businesses to prepare for going into the private sector nature market, and funds a number of options like baseline surveys and getting the business ready to take up the nature market side. That's mainly DEFRA funding. There's also other government departments and local authorities that may well have funding as well. Department of Health, green social prescribing is an up-and-coming area. Department of Education may also have some funding that is related to nature as well. And then there's quite a few local schemes, and possibly too many for us to list today. So that's the government schemes. For many, that is going to be the primary route for funding for the environment, and it's the easiest, most straightforward way for many. Nature markets, as I said at the beginning, these are the offset markets where you will be creating credits or units in order to sell for another business to use that as part of their business accounting. This is usually some businesses and organizations that have an environmental impact, whether that's on nature or climate or on water, and they will want to buy credits or units in order to offset any unavoidable environmental impacts that they have. And that unavoidable impacts is very important when it comes to the credibility. One of the key things with nature markets and the offset markets is measurement and verification. There are quite high standards, high requirements for measurement and verification. So a lot more hoops to jump through in a lot of senses to get into those markets. But there are opportunities for land managers to go into a long-term alternative income stream. Not everybody is happy with offset markets, it's fair to say. Some people say that they're an excuse to pollute and there's no overall progress, and you may well have seen programs on TV sort of exposing some of the problems with the international schemes. But overall, I think they are a good thing. They do make up for losses that are unavoidable. They do embed responsibility within the businesses as well, and it helps to speed up compliance. So they do have their place. There are two different types of nature markets. There's firstly the compliance markets, which I mentioned earlier, biodiversity net gain being the main one in England, and nutrient neutrality, which is offsetting, both of those are offsetting development impacts on the environment. The first one on nature, the second one on nutrients going into certain catchments. And then there's the voluntary markets for carbon, and there's an emerging voluntary nature market as well. There's also an emerging water offset market as well, which is starting to be discussed as well. That's more about water volumes rather than water quality. So the business funding or corporate funding is another route that is really starting to gain momentum. So this is really where businesses are looking at their marketing and their environmental responsibility and looking to fund projects. Many of them it tends to come through either as grants or sometimes as benchmarking advice. You will be familiar with corporate funding. These are happening already. So some of the banks are already funding things like carbon audits, and water companies are quite well known for providing grants for equipment or for changing land use, for example, and they quite often provide advice as well. And I think when we're talking about environmental funding, we shouldn't just be looking about the monetary value. I think there's really important value in some of these other associated benefits, such as the benchmarking or the advice. There are many evolving models in corporate funding. We've seen sponsorship models. We've seen crowdfunding models. The government actually has a model a platform at the moment where they're looking at getting business funding to fund projects as well. So they're facilitating some of this business funding. Essentially, with these ones, there's a bit more freedom to contract. You're maybe not quite as restricted as you would be with the nature markets, where the need for high integrity is and making sure there's no double counting and the measurement is accurate is really essential. There is a bit more freedom to contract with corporate and business funding. So if you're interested in these markets, looking at getting into identifying environmental funding, you've got ideas for environmental projects, how do you get into them? There are three main models that are in operation. This is generally outside the government schemes. The first one is to develop your own project, where you'll create the nature units or carbon units for sale. You can either sell them now or in the future. The second one is where you might work with a project developer. That could be a local wildlife trust or other business who's expert in developing these projects, and then enter into a management agreement through them. The project developer will provide skills, a bit of market knowledge, negotiation, knowledge about how to make the best use of the land that you've got as well. And then the third is a leasehold option, where, and this is very common in habitat banking, where there's a leasehold option where you will lease the land to somebody else and then they will do all the work of developing the project and taking more of the risk, essentially. They'll create the units and be responsible for making the sales. Each of them has got pros and cons, and I think it will depend on where you are and what your knowledge base is as to how confident you feel about developing these projects yourself. As far as where to start, I think it's easy. It's easy on paper that you start at the beginning, you decide what you want to do, you think about where you are now, what your baseline is. You then assess what local market opportunities there are, what interests you. You then build your local knowledge and your relationships, and then you identify your partners and the projects, and then you negotiate an agreement. It is much more it is much more complicated than that, and I think the experiences that you'll hear about in a minute will highlight those. So I am now going to hand over to Helen, who is going to take us through in more detail about all the steps that you need to think about as you go through this journey.
Thank you. Oh, excellent. Here we go. Yeah, so I thought we were asked by government actually to develop what I'm going to walk you through in a moment, which we fondly refer to as the worm. It used to be called the snake, but it's been had a rebrand as this one's for farmers. And it actually sort of walks you through the various milestones that you'll go through as you're thinking about engaging in any of these nature markets. So it's a free resource. It's on our website, and I can give that at the end. But essentially, it provides an introduction to nature markets for farmers, and then provides this step-by-step guide of what creating a nature market looks like in practice. And we always sort of just share that we had input from over 100 farmers into this toolkit. We took it out to about, excuse me. We took it out to about probably 15 to 20 farmer clusters and had them feed in as well. So it's really designed to sort of just answer some of the questions that you might have as you're thinking about, are these really right for me? It doesn't give any advice at all. Oh, thank you. I've got some, but thank you. Thanks. It doesn't give any advice at all. It's really about, if you're starting out and thinking about, are these right for me? You're probably thinking, I don't know what I don't know. So the aim of the toolkit, and I'll go through it in a bit more in a moment, and what it will tell you is kind of just ask, it provides you with the questions that you might not have thought to ask yourself. So it's more sort of like considerations as you're going through each step of that journey that you can think about, and then some resources of where you can go and try and find some of the answers. As you can appreciate, everything's up, like, it's such a fast moving sector. Nature markets at the moment, it's quite hard to update such a massive resource every day. So it's more just about letting you know the things you need to be thinking about. It's an online website, and as I say, it was launched in January. But we have had it reviewed again by farmers, and now we're looking to just raise a bit more funding and make it a bit more accessible. We've got a couple of podcasts on there, and we'll have more podcasts, but the feedback is, can we have shorter videos rather than all this very long text? And also, but all the content is there. We're just looking to sort of make it a bit more interactive. But essentially, these are the milestones that you'll go through if you're thinking about engaging in a nature market. So if you're thinking about selling woodland carbon or peatland carbon through peatland restoration, soil carbon, and then we've got other carbons being developed like hydrocarbon, salt marsh carbon. If you're thinking about selling biodiversity net gain units, the toolkit can help you. And also if you're thinking about developing a natural flood management project, how you might do that. So the first step is really, on this journey of the worm, is thinking about assessing your land opportunities. So within the toolkit, we just sort of share with you the things you want to ask yourself, like, what's my vision for the land? Stuff you probably already have. What's appropriate for my land? What's the history of my land? What's the local nature recovery strategy? What are my neighbours doing? So, like, what actually could I do on my land? What's how much productive land do I have, and what's not productive that maybe I could use, and in which case, what kind of things could I look at doing? So that's sort of your first assessing your land opportunities. And just to say, like, we've put them in this linear fashion, but typically if you're thinking about nature markets, you're going to be thinking about all these things at the same time. So, but the first one is obviously what do I got and what do I want to do? The second is like working with other farmers. So we do mention it in the toolkit, but you might be too small, perhaps, to sell to a buyer. You just won't be able to create enough units on your own. So you might want to work with other farmers in your area. So we go through, how would you look at working with other farmers? How would you find a farmer cluster in your area if you're not part of one already? Do you want to set up a farmer cluster? How might you start bringing people together? And we provide some case studies of farmers who've already done that with neighbouring farmers. Then we go through baselining, planning, and measuring. This is the other thing you're going to want to do. Roughly how much can you expect to pay for baselining? So we offer some examples of those, things you're going to have to think about in your measurements, things about verification. If you're entering into any of these markets, Woodland Carbon Code, Peatland Carbon Code, for example, all require verification. So we just refer you to that. And then working with buyers. So we recommend early on you start to think about who your buyers are, because if there's no demand, then don't waste your time. So how do you start to identify buyers in your area and then actually start to approach them? At what stage in your journey should you do that? Are you too small? Do you need more of you to do that? Are there people you can go to who've already done that? What type of buyers will actually want to buy what you're going to sell? How does this fit in with your overall farm business planning, which is obviously really important? Nature markets are what we consider some supplementary or complementary revenue for a farmer. They're not the be-all and end-all. So certainly, how does it fit in with your much broader business? And then what's your liability and risk management? Like, what's the political risk? Is there any reputational risk if you're dealing with a buyer who maybe... I'm just throwing it out there as like an oil company. Is that something you want to get involved in? If they're buying your carbon credits, you might not. There are buyer guidelines that exist that you can turn to. And you can, as I say, the website will talk you through all of those. And as you're thinking about also political risk, we've obviously potentially having a change of government in the next week or so. What's that going to mean for you? We're not crystal ball gazers ourselves, but we just provide you with questions that you can ask yourself, like, is this really the right time for me? And then essentially, if you're engaged in a nature market, so if you're selling carbon, that can be like just a contract between you and the buyer. However, if you're operating at a much larger landscape scale, or you're operating with other farmers, what you might need is some upfront finance to pay for those interventions that you're going to have to make on land. So in which case, then you would look at how do you start using repayable finance? So how do you start approaching perhaps a bank? What's the kind of, what are lenders going to be looking for as they think about lending you upfront money? But say that particular point isn't necessarily something you're always going to do if you've just got a transaction between you and a buyer. And then finally, we just walk through legal contracts. There are lots of templates out there, not as many as we'd probably like, but we point to some of those on the way. So I think I've gone through all these. And then just finally, so we included case studies to bring some of these to life. The Glenn's in there as well. Spain's Hall Estate, Glendronachin, the Welsh one was Peatland Carbon, and we're adding more. The challenge we have is that there aren't many farmers doing this that have got to a point where they've made a sale. So we actually have quite a small repository of case studies, but hopefully we'll add to them. And then before I just pass over to Glenn, who I'm sure can bring this all to life, it's probably worth saying this. Anyone here in NERF round 3? Okay, great. So NERF round 3, you will be using the worm actually on your own self-assessment and have like much deeper teach-ins on each of the milestones as well, which will all be made public through the community of practice on the SharePoint through NERF 3. So if you are interested in understanding more about some of those milestones and what other farmers are going through NERF round 3, you can just join the community of practice. You don't have to be involved in NERF 3. So you can just email the EA, or you can email me and I'll get you the right address if you want to be part of those conversations.
Thank you, Helen. I'm going to try and give you a little bit of real-life context to some of this stuff now, because there's an awful lot of talk out there, and It's a really nascent market. It's not quite as simple as it sounds on paper. So we'll give you a bit of help with that, hopefully. But I would say to anybody that's really looking seriously at land use change for nature and nature markets, to the GFI toolkit is a really excellent place to start. And we were actually a NERF round one project, and a lot of that learning and information is kind of disseminated in there. So yeah, some really good information. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we kind of see all of this coming together, and this diagram just really breaks the nature market thing down into 5 broad buckets plus public finance in the middle, and this is sort of how we're seeing things emerge. Now, my experience with Wendling Beck is slightly different. So that's predominantly a biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality project. It's 100% private finance, but we are working through Swallowtail on about 12 projects at the moment, cover about 500,000 acres, and they're all slightly different. They're taking very, very different approaches. I think the underlying natural capital is very different in each circumstance, and the size of the projects, the complexity, the number of landowners, etc. Every project is fairly unique in that respect. But we really see money flowing from various different sources. So the first bucket in the top left is looking at sort of institutional investment, and the brands that you can see on here are just kind of randomly selected from organisations that we know are active in that space. But there are other organisations are available. At the moment, the institutional investment is heavily aligned to carbon. And we're seeing that particularly focused on peatland, emerging salt marsh, and then as you kind of get further north within England, potential within the woodland carbon code. But the reason for that is that those investors are looking for a return on investment. They're generally quite competitive returns on investment, similar to what they would look at from other forms of investment, so 10 to 15% return. And I think they really see carbon as being the opportunity to realise that return on investment. So the carbon price at the moment, there's an expectation that it's priced quite low compared to the future demand, and that supply and demand will push that price up over time. So I think the hedge there for those institutional investors is that increase in the carbon price over time. There is a bit of interest in things like biodiversity and biodiversity net gain in particular. They don't really understand that in detail. They kind of see that as a potential added benefit. But at the moment, a lot of that investment is looking into the carbon space. Compliance market, as Susan kind of explained, really heavily focused around biodiversity net gain, nutrients, water to some extent, and tends to be focused around developers, construction companies, lots of major infrastructure, NSIC projects, etc. going on, where there is a loss to nature or a degradation of nature through a development, and then that developer having to offset that and potentially provide a net gain as part of that process. The bottom bucket is quite a complex one. So looking at supply chains, environmental social governance, CSR, which is corporate social responsibility, whatever you want to call it. This is where big corporates are really looking to invest in nature for a reason that kind of exists within their supply chain. So could, in our case, Anglian Water are a partner in the Wendling Beck, really heavily focused on nature-based solutions for water quality and to some extent water security. Coca-Cola are kind of heavily investing into this space in Norfolk as well. And we have emerging frameworks coming into this bucket as well. So TNFD is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. It's kind of the successor to TCFD, which was the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and that formed a framework for a lot of the carbon reporting that you're seeing going on at the moment, and that's kind of driving that carbon market from the corporates at the moment. So there is potential that TNFD could start to focus big corporates on looking at their nature impacts and their nature footprint, and that over time that could become a big driver into nature markets. But we really need kind of governments globally to get behind some of these policies to kind of, as organisations are being audited, to really understand what's going on. And without that kind of compliance element of at least understanding what's happening on the ground, it's going to take a long time for those markets to really take off. We then have these kind of credit platforms and various ones on there. I think I heard Soil Association Exchange talking over in one of the other tents earlier. Lots of different platforms on here, Credit Nature, Replanet. You'll be familiar with some of those brands. And these are really looking at a kind of a combination of investing in soil health, water quality, biodiversity uplift, and packaging that into a credit, which will form part of a voluntary biodiversity market, which is really quite an emerging space at the moment. And then philanthropy, we feel really still plays quite a big part in this. The philanthropists, I hope there's none in the room, tend to be slight goal hangers because they look for where the gaps in the finance are, and they like to come in at the end and kind of close that gap and take a lot of the credit for it, which is still really a worthy position to be in. But we do see that philanthropy is quite an important within this space. And I think if you look at some of the international markets where there's probably a longer track record around investing in nature, that blend of philanthropic and private finance and public finance, particularly the US mitigation markets that have kind of been in existence for probably 5 decades now, there's quite a lot that we can learn from those with that kind of blend of finance. And then it really depends on the opportunities within the natural capital as to the percentage of that blend and how that works. And frameworks like landscape recovery, which Susan mentioned, top tier of ELM, is a great example of how government are looking to leverage private finance for nature-based solutions. So this just expands out a little bit from those buckets and just explains where the ecosystem service opportunities are within those. So that institutional investment, again, as we said, heavily aligned around carbon. The compliance markets really is focused around biodiversity net gain, nutrients if you're in the right zone. So it has to be a catchment where there is an adverse effect on the nutrients flowing into it. So an SAC site generally, and those different catchments are quite well documented. So if you're not sure if you're in one, there will be information available to tell you that. But that is quite a convenient pathway for projects into generating private investment into projects. There is a kind of something that happens within that planning system where you leverage huge value from putting a tick in a planning box, and suddenly land values change from sort of £10,000 to £12,000 an acre for arable or agricultural through to sort of £1 million an acre for development land, and that kind of hold over the developer to be able to ensure that they're creating a nature impact offset or a nutrient offset to be able to get that planning. There's a real vested interest in doing that. And as that planning system's settled down, I mean, BNG only came into force on the 12th of February, so it's really early days. But we do see that as a huge tool for driving investment into nature. The bottom bucket, again, really looking at heavily focused around water security in particular, but also carbon within that space to some extent. Some of those corporates really looking at that. Direct investment into carbon. So Aviva would be a good example of that are heavily investing in carbon projects nationally. The compliance, or the credits platforms, again, looking at sort of that co-benefits of soil, water, air, biodiversity uplift and kind of bundling those together. And then the philanthropists are a bit more people and community focused. So what are these projects doing for wider society and where are those benefits? So boiling all of that down, if you are looking at projects, they're all the kind of things that you need to be looking at to see where your market is, where those buyers might exist, where those opportunities are, and then again, what you've got within the land holdings. So there are lots of challenges. I mean, it is very, very early days in these markets. There isn't a huge amount of money changing hands, but there is a huge amount of hope, and there is a lot of conversations going on. There's a lot of projects that are quite poised, very close to investment now. So we really need to get a few of those through the door to give landowners and investors alike a bit of confidence in this. The main issues from our point of view are really government policy is a big one. So we have issues with tax. There was some clarification recently in the budget, but I don't think that made it through the finance bill before they dissolved Parliament. So there's still a little bit of work to do on that. The long-termness of these contracts is a kind of a double-edged sword. So whilst from an investment point of view and from a land use point of view, it can be, and probably from a nature point of view, it's really beneficial to have those contracts as long as possible. That does kind of tie up the landowners, so there's succession planning and just the complexities that go alongside that. Our project, we have a 100-year finance plan with 4 landowners in Wendling Beck, and it's been really quite a challenging process to get all of that governance in place. And I think probably there could be more done around trying to help projects with some of that governance structure. And then there is some uncertainty around insurance and force majeure. What happens if things go wrong? What happens if your woodland burns down or your grasslands burns down? Does it need insuring? What's the penalty? Do you have to replay that? Is it kind of consequential loss, or is this about just resetting whatever that initial investment was? That makes a big difference. And organisations like the National Farmers Union, or NFU Mutual, I should say, are looking at new tools. And there's organisations like Kita that are specialist insurers in some of these things as well. But that also comes with a cost. So as you're planning these projects, you need to really understand what the long-term cost of these is going to be. Lots of uncertainty within the market. Not really a huge amount of money changing hands. That would definitely help give everybody a bit of security. There's a lack of common sense common sense as well. There's a lack of a common approach to some of the metrics and platforms. I was with a whole bunch of academics on Tuesday, and I've kind of bored them with asking for some standardization in the way that we're measuring nature. That would be really helpful, and it would help everybody sort of focus on a common objectives and common approaches to this. And having so many different metrics in the market, taking slightly different approaches, particularly when you're looking at long-term investment, both from an investor point of view and a landowner point of view, which one do you pick? Who do you go with? Who are you going to put your money on? And that really needs to kind of settle down. And then in terms of delivery, there's issues with the cost of some of this, particularly in the early days. The baselining cost can be very expensive. With big collaborative agreements, how do you make them equitable? How do you make sure that you're going to get on with your neighbours, or your kids are going to get on with your neighbours' kids, or whatever it might be? So lots of considerations in there. Uncertainty around climate and changing weather patterns, so it's very difficult to establish some of these high distinctiveness habitats when you've got droughts and floods and everything else. And really that resilience needs to be built into your cost planning over the long term, and also your monitoring and things like force majeure and re-establishment if needed as well. And then inflation is a huge one on that long term cost. And then the positives, there is kind of light at the end of this tunnel. The land managers are really quite interested. There's a massive amount of interest. I think we're seeing that particularly through landscape recovery. Lots of people getting on board, lots of collaboration going on, lots of farm clusters starting to form, and that's got to be good for the industry overall. Global assets and under management, you've seen a huge increase in the values. So globally, 2.2 trillion in 2000, can't read that from here, 15, I think, to 18.4 trillion in 2021. And that kind of trend is continuing as organizations understand the value of the natural capital and how it affects their supply chains. Things like TNFD have huge potential in driving these markets forward. We're starting to see much more kind of corporate focus on this, and hopefully, if there is a change of government, then that continues. That we need kind of governments to hold organisations to account on this over the long term and at a kind of a global level, not just within the UK. And yeah, things are starting to get going. The frameworks are becoming clearer. The lawyers are getting used to some of the new legal agreements. You've got things like conservation covenants that are starting to become more understood. We're getting better governance and compliance. So we now have a British standard for high integrity nature markets, which is hugely helpful. It's still early doors, but things like that will start to give everybody a little bit of confidence in this. And we have got some direction as of the budget, certainly within the thinking on what that tax possession should be. And then finally, just technology is playing a huge part in this as well. So we're starting to see lots of tech, lots of AI, lots of stuff that I don't really understand. But it is starting to drive down the cost of this. It's starting to speed up the processes. There's a combination of kind of ground truthing with ecologists and people on the ground, and actually using tech to kind of drive that process as well. So I think I'll shut up there and we can have a...
Thanks, Glenn. I'm very glad you finished on the positives there, because I think it can feel really daunting, I think, looking at this marketplace, first in its entirety and the way it's operating. But even when you're looking at it from a landowner's perspective about what do I do next, it can feel incredibly challenging in what to do and how to do it and where to go next. I am going to open this up for questions. So if you'd like to put your hand up if you've got a question for any of us up here, that would be great. In the meantime, there's one in the middle here. Well, there's two, actually. I do have a question of my own, but I'll go to the floor first.
Thank you. So I'm working on a landscape recovery project in the Wye Valley, and two big questions that we have from our land managers in this early stage is about how entering these markets would affect the value of their land, and also if you could offer any more insights on succession planning and how you've addressed that in projects, that would be really interesting.
Land values, I don't know if anybody wants to take that one. I mean, I think for land values is it's an unknown, I would say. It depends how it's done. I've seen cases where BNG has been spread throughout a holding, and it's probably added value to the entirety of the holding because it's been designed that way to add interest to the holding. In other situations, you could see you do a BNG contract, you could end up with a designation, a triple SI designation on it, and it will probably have a lower value. I think the task that you need to do is try and think ahead and make sure you build any change in land valuation into your negotiations. But it is crystal ball territory, and there's nothing, that interim, if you're selling BNG land while you've got a contract on it, we're not there yet. We haven't got any evidence to know what's going to be. So I think we'll learn more about that as time goes on. But the point is that you need to think about it at the negotiation stage so that you've got your bases covered and that you're content with any impacts that it might have. On the succession side, anybody want to...
I'll take a stab. So we have put quite a lot of thought into this. It's taken us 18 months to come up with an agreement just for Wendling Beck with 4 landowners, and that's ended up as a limited liability partnership, partly because it gives us the most flexibility. But the advisors are just starting to get their head around this. Where you have really big collaborations like landscape recovery, it's quite tricky. You often have a farm cluster embedded in there as well, so you might end up with kind of a community interest company sitting alongside some kind of corporate vehicle or special purpose vehicle. I think things like co-ops are really worth looking at for landscape recovery particularly. The challenge is to kind of come up with an equitable agreement that binds that over the long term. So it does depend somewhat on what you're doing. So Wye Valley, quite a lot of nutrient opportunity presumably. They're really long-term agreements. That can have a big effect on the land value as well as the succession planning. So I think like any succession planning, it needs land managers and landowners to be open-minded, to kind of have a bit of a plan. So I don't think it's necessarily any different from how you would approach a farm business in some respects. It's just a different way of doing things with some longer term planning in there. And actually some of that longer term planning can be helpful from a succession point of view. So every case and every farm is going to be really different. So it's a kind of a tricky one. But I think the headline is don't duck it. Just, take that as part of the overall approach. I'll just say really quickly on land values as well, because it's a big concern. I mean, the way to mitigate that is to try and build the land capital cost into the finance model. So particularly if you've got things like coastal realignment, where the land is definitely going to come out of production permanently, then you have to try and write off that land capital value within the finance model, which is easier said than done. But I think you just have to go into it with your eyes wide open in that respect.
Thank you. And any other question? There's one here and then one over here.
Thank you. I have a quite decent-sized biodiversity net gain scheme in Somerset, and I feel a real advocate for it. I can really get behind it. If someone wants to ask me about it, I really believe in it. I can't say I feel the same way about carbon credits. I mean, is there anything you can tell me that would make me feel that it actually works, and whether I can, if I wanted to go further with it, that I would be doing something that is part of something that really works?
Helen, is that one for you? I mean, I've got views on everything, but
I think it's more of a view than a maybe, Glenn, you've got some more numbers around it than. But my view is that carbon credits, they get a lot of bad rap, and that's unfortunate. And it's I used to be a journalist, so I can say this. There's a few journalists who don't quite understand the damage they're doing, but I keep banging on about how bad carbon credits are. They actually do what they're supposed to do, which is sequester carbon and get trees in the ground. And I can't think of another way that we can do that in the next decade this quick. So carbon credits I have a lot of time for. I don't always think, this woodland carbon credits I'm talking about, and peatland carbon is avoidance, and that's a different issue. So yes, I personally think that if you've got land that can take a woodland, why wouldn't we all? The question is, do we have that land that you're prepared to put into woodland creation for 30 odd years? And not many of us do want to do that, because then you've got to become basically a forester. But in terms of do they work, yeah, sort of. I mean, the numbers are, we're learning all the time. It's not perfect, but at least we're doing something, and there's nothing wrong with more trees, is my opinion, but it's just an opinion. That's just from what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have their place. So long as the businesses that are buying them are doing everything they can to reduce their emissions first, and then it's only the unavoidable emissions that are offset. The agriculture sector will potentially need to do some offsetting themselves, or insetting, because producing food is unlikely to be net zero in its own right. So we do have to be realistic that if we're going to get to net zero by 2050, there's definitely a place for carbon credits. The market itself is difficult, and I would agree with Helen that there is some very bad press out there, and there's probably some bad practices. Some of the bad press has been based on bad practices elsewhere, but I do think it definitely has a place. What the UK government is doing is they've got this BSI, British Standards Institute project, that is looking at setting standards for high integrity. The intention being that it will set the UK as a good place to buy credits under those standards. So on a global market, because carbon is carbon wherever it's sequestered, in a global market, the UK, the aim is that the UK will be seen as a real credible place, a real good place to buy carbon credits from. So, and that robustness within the marketplace is an essential step on that one.
I think that's a really good point, just to come on. So our codes are like really high quality, because we've got this British Standards Institute flex standard, and there are more standards being developed. You can put faith, I think, in UK carbon codes and carbon credits if you do the mitigation hierarchy. So in theory, companies should feel comfortable buying carbon credits from a UK a business or a project developer or farmer that's gone through the codes. That I think is an important point. The money, the cost, unfortunately, the price for woodland carbon at the moment is, however, too low. So that needs to go up.
So there's a question down here, and then there's one over at the side here.
Hello, Louise Resler from Soil Association Exchange. Thank you so much. That was a really excellent presentation. The question that I have is that I know you mentioned it just now, Susan, but actually in the presentations, there wasn't an explicit mention of insetting, so whereby supply chain businesses pay farmers to do good stuff on farms in exchange for being able to report on the benefits, but the farmers don't sell away their carbon benefits and there aren't credits exchanging hands. So I was just curious to know, was there a particular reason why that didn't sort of come up explicitly, and what are your thoughts on insetting?
There was no reason why I didn't mention it other than time and focusing on the nature markets. I think in terms of the transition to regen agriculture, I think there's a really strong place. So the corporate businesses are looking at doing the right thing. They're being required to look at their scope 3 emissions, which for many of the food businesses looking right down the supply chain at the production. And there's definitely a place there for helping businesses to decarbonise and to sequester carbon. So as far as the CLA is concerned, we're supportive of the insetting. I think the language can get a little bit difficult on some of those, but the key thing is, and what we always say to our members, is that if you're thinking about selling your soil carbon or taking payment for soil carbon sequestration, you should ensure that it is on a contract as part of the supply chain, not as a credit. You don't really want to be sending, in our view, we don't want to be selling credits from the soil carbon because of the risks of it not being there permanently. Any other views?
I'd just add that I think to some extent it's down to the metric that you're using as well. So the metric, a good metric will take into account the carbon that the agribusiness is using as well, and then it should be the surplus that's kind of tradable. Certainly within the challenge within supply chains is holding on to that value. That's what we're hearing from farmers and landowners, that they're quite used to being bullied by the supply chain historically, and I think they're nervous that they know the supply chain wants all this stuff and to some extent needs all of this stuff, whether it's carbon or biodiversity uplift or whatever it is. But how do you hold on to that value and not ensure that it's the kind of the lowest point of entry? And I think you've obviously got an emerging metric as well, which is looking at that. So those things, those tools are really important in that process, because it will allow people to hold on to that value and make sure that they're not selling more than they need for themselves, if that makes sense.
So at the British Standards it's institution, not institute. It's quite strange, isn't it? I think it is. British Standards Institution is looking within its standards at insetting to include them. It's so early days. I think there's a working group going to be starting up soon around insetting and how that's going to work. And our recommendation, is the only advice we give in the whole of the toolkit, is basically understand your carbon footprint so you're not selling more than you're going to need to offset yourself, your business, and also just baseline if you can afford to baseline. There are companies that might pay you to baseline through your supply chain, just so you know what you got now. That would be sort of a safe bet.
Great. There's a question at the front here now.
Do you think we should be concerned about speed of market development? And specifically, there are 60 landscape recovery projects that within 3 years need a huge amount of money from the private sector rather. And DEFRA is relying on the private sector to show up with hundreds of millions, possibly billions of pounds for those 60 projects, literally within less than 3 years.
I know Helen and I are going to agree on this one.
We do not have enough demand for what we are creating, is the challenge we have at the moment. Government has done amazing things around developing supply, all the NERF funds, round 3 now. We've got over 200 projects in the UK and however many farmer clusters also developing. But we do not have the demand. We only have 2 compliance markets, B&G and nutrient neutrality. It's only project developers, although B&G does expand out next year. And the rest is all voluntary. And at the moment, there's just no push on companies. We host the TNFD that Glenn mentioned, and there are 50 UK adopters. Oxbury Bank is one that's been reporting on TNFD and leading the way, really. But there aren't many companies who are actually thinking about what's our nature impacts and dependencies, and therefore how can we start, even through CSR, start giving money out for nature restoration. We don't have the demand, and I think that's what we need to ask of an incoming government.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that. I do think there is an opportunity, though, for landowners and managers now to be thinking and preparing and getting skilled up and taking appropriate advice about what they could and might do. I mean, there are some other barriers on the land supply side, the tax issue being one, which is still in a little bit of hiatus despite our lobbying. We sent our first letter into government in March 2019, and we have made progress, but even now the tax changes aren't through yet, and it won't be until April 2025 at the earliest that they'll come into effect. So there are quite a few other things from the land supply side that still need to be resolved. But the big, if there was a demand, I think we would see a much faster tracking into project development as well, because you'd have some really concrete examples. Okay, there's a question in the middle. I think this will need to be the last question. I've kind of lost track of time, but yeah, this will need to be the last one. There's a microphone.
Thank you. It was just a follow-up question to that, really. You mentioned you'd like to see more demand, and that would fall to the next government. I wonder what specifically you'd like to see from the next government, and given where the polls are, the likelihood you see of that happening.
So we're asking for one, TCFD was voluntary, and when you look at how many companies actually reported on the disclosures, only 4% reported on 11 of those on the full 11 disclosures. Like, voluntary disclosure doesn't work. Like, companies will just do what they can, other than Oxbury, who's doing an amazing job on TNFD and TCFD. Shout out to Caroline. So we're saying make disclosures on what your impacts and dependencies are on nature mandatory, like mandate companies to start measuring and reporting what they're doing. That's the first one. One of the challenges, though, they don't then have a pathway. So they're like, shit, we've just told our shareholders how rubbish we are, but what do we now do? So we need what we're calling nature positive pathways. WWF has done quite a lot of work on this already, so companies can understand in their sectors or the agri-food whole system, like, what do I now need to do to meet the EIP, to meet the Global Biodiversity Framework? So, in terms of biodiversity uplift, soil health uplift, water quality improvements, what do I need to do? What's the government asking for me? And then I think you'll start to see the money moving, because companies will go, I've got a really clear path. A government is telling me that I need to be in this. And the other thing is we need more compliance markets, I think, at this early stage. Those would be on my wish list.
And then I'd probably just add to that, an expansion of the community of practice. The NERF community of practice has got fantastic information. If you're looking for inspiration about what you could do, how you can do it, is fantastic. But I just don't think it's well enough promoted. And a big part of landowners coming forward with land is looking at the art of the possible and looking for inspiration, which there's plenty of it around here. So, but I think that online community of practice is something I would like to see alongside all these other things that Helen's mentioned. Glenn, last word.
I would embed the environment at the centre of their growth policy. I think that would be kind of key for me. So we saw it with a previous Prime Minister that was kind of trying to deregulate the environmental stuff to kind of fuel growth, which is a kind of really short-sighted way. If you put the environment at the centre of that growth policy, you create a whole industry of green jobs. You uplift your natural capital instead of destroying it, and you generate growth, and it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So that would be mine.
Brilliant. I think we are definitely out of time now. Thank you so much for coming along. Thank you very much to the panel, Helen and Glenn. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any other questions, feel free to come up and speak to us, and hopefully see you around the show sometime soon. Thank you.